Welcome, age of vintage society. On Fred McMurray there are two schools of thought. The first is that he's a wonderful guy, modest, friendly, mild-mannered, unassuming, level-headed, practical, and unforgivably sane in a city built on bluster. They'll tell you that Fred never had anything bad happen to him. He had never gone missing at sea. In the deepest jungles of Africa he's never been offered for supper. He was never referred to as magnificently mad, not even a smidgen of tetchiness. He could never be accused of attempting to snare Errol Flynn's banner line. Another Fred McMurray is revealed by the second school of thought, one that is extremely amusing and amazing at times. This is McMurray the man, as he is known by his closest friends, at home, away from the limelight of attention. Why Fred McMurray never had a grumpy day in his life. Make sure to watch the video until the end and leave your thoughts in the comments. If you are new here, join our wonderful community by subscribing to the Age of Vintage channel. His attitude towards his job best explains why his closest friends and family could see him for who he truly was. Why did strangers have to just accept him as a good man and move on? Fred grinned as he says, "I just can't take it all too seriously. Just because I become a movie star doesn't mean I'm the poor man's Superman. Mine wasn't a God-given gift meant to be shared with the rest of the world. When I was younger I didn't try to imitate Charlie Chaplin. I didn't walk on the streets of New York City wishing to be a ham. No one ever referred to me as a disgruntled genius. It just so happened that I received a break. A slew of other guys could have done the job just as well. I've never been one to speak much. I've never been one to express myself theatrically." So, by Hollywood standards, he was lacking in colour. He was labelled as a bad copywriter, one who was not a hot commodity. To appease the publicity department he once concocted a fantastic whopper. On the same day they staged a prank and set fire to Dorothy Lamour's sarong. Her tale made the front pages of newspapers across the country. He was given one line. After that he resolved to remain true to himself. Fortunately for Fred, his self-imposed restrictions are merely subjective. There wasn't a single glamour girl in Hollywood who wouldn't give her sables to be in a photograph with him. Carole Lombard and Clark Gable, among others, think he was one of the greatest individuals in the profession because of his lack of colour. They adored his unassuming wit, his solemn demeanour, although he does not take himself seriously. One of Carole's favourite anecdotes is about the time the Gables suddenly visited the McMurrays. Clark and Carole heard the most incredible sounds emanating from the house as they drove up the driveway. They crept over to the library window and peered in, perplexed. Carole was on the verge of laughing out loud when she caught a glimpse of him. Fred stood in the middle of the room. His jaw was clenched. His demeanour was strained. He'd walk up to the Victrola, bend his ear to the loudspeaker, and then walk back to the room's centre. He then put a reed between his lips and tossed his head back. The loud cry of a wild duck sprang from his throat. Fred had just received his first record of a duck-calling correspondence course the day before. Clark and Carole went into convulsions. Fred imitated a teal, a spring, a mallard, and a bluebill, as though reciting Shakespeare. This information came in handy in One Night in Lisbon. The scene where Fred steps out on Madeleine Carroll's balcony was one of Fred's favourites. With the love talk of a wild teal, he woos her. Madeleine takes the initiative. "I don't believe it would be quite as ducky for personal and private petting," Fred explains. When it comes to personal and private matters, Lily and Fred McMurray have a set of rules for living. Their 8-room home is a replica of an early American home. Unlike other movie mansions, theirs does not make them feel like they're on the run from an interior designer. They collected and picked every piece of bric-a-brac and every piece of furniture from all around the country. The ashtrays are antiques. The house is overrun with ruby glass vases choked with flowers. There are antique oil burners and wonderful small silver collections. Cushions can be heaped on the floor, as Fred frequently does when relaxing in front of the fireplace. The glass cabinet containing Fred's gun collection is prominently displayed in the library. These are also American, although from a different era. It was a florist's nursery when they initially discovered their property. Fred scribbled a cheque for the down payment. He purchased the towing trees, flowering plants, and all of the dense, lush vegetation. In the centre, a spot was made available. Their house was erected right in the middle of nature's magnificence. Little Susan McMurray, Jack McMurray, English setter, Penny McMurray, Pomeranian, Snowy White McMurray, cat, Gladys and Lorenzo, who managed the best kitchen in town, are among the happy owner's close friends. A possum will occasionally visit them late at night. That 4-footed fifth column was here again, Fred always remarked when his vegetable garden had been looted. The McMurrays never lost their hearts and minds to success, because their romance rose in tandem with their riches. Fred's admission that he was just as happy playing the sax in Roberta is refreshing. There were no station wagons to be found. There was, however, an old Graham automobile. He could order a Cadillac just by picking up the phone at his peak, and he pays in cash. He's appreciative, but not impressed in the least. They met for the first time during the New York run of Roberta. Lily's dazzling brand of beauty earned her a spot on the show as a model. Every night she walked in while Fred played Smoke Gets in Your Eyes. It was adopted as their song. No one else had a clue, which made it more thrilling. When their song is performed, their eyes naturally meet across a crowded room. When the Californian collegian saw Fred performing in Warner's Hollywood Theatre pit, he joined Roberta. He recently completed his second work for Warner Brothers, as a co-star with Errol Flynn in Dive Bomber this time. Those long-ago days are still a popular topic of discussion. Nothing makes Fred happier than sitting around his barbecue pit with good friends and remembering. The Gables, Ray Milland, Claude Binion, who has written some of Fred's best scripts, John Howard, who thinks his steaks are far more glamorous than Fred's, Waston Webb, one of Hollywood's best cutters, Leslie Fenton and Anne Dvorak are frequently among the group. Fred was the large silent type when it comes to barbecue. While ribbing him, John Howard attacks him as if his life relied on the outcome. He was never able to make a steak that made him beam with approval. Fred will always resort to Lily as if everything was her fault. "Lily, we used the wrong charcoal," he'll exclaim. "We overheated the fire." Fred was as quiet as a mouse around the house for a 6-footer, 6 feet 3½ inches to be exact. He sits by the hour oiling and polishing his guns if they don't go to the movies. While Lily knits, he hums to himself. If she glances up quickly enough, she might catch him staring at her with a loving look in his eyes. He instantly returns to his task when he is caught. He doesn't say anything, but Lily, on the other hand, is aware of the situation. She didn't at first. Fred's aversion to showmanship or persons who draw attention to themselves caused him to turn the other way. Fred was ecstatic with his wife. He was well aware that she was regarded as one of Hollywood's most beautiful women. However, expressing his gratitude in words made him feel self-conscious. Lily was dressed in a beautiful purple outfit when he arrived home one evening. She waited for him to speak out. Finally she mentioned that it was a dyed white one from last summer. Fred's face was flushed with disappointment. "But Lily, it was my favourite dress," he protested. "Why did you ruin it?" Lily and Mal Milland swapped hats on another occasion. Lily's was a complicated little thing, with a veil that fits like a mask across the eyes. She showed Fred the Lily-a phone number Mal had given her in exchange. "Please, Lily, get your hat back," Fred pleaded. "That one looked better on you than any other hat you've ever worn." Lily had never heard this before. She went to Mal, and the two of them had a great laugh over it. "Did you get your hat back from Mal?" Fred nearly asked as he got in that night. Nothing made Fred happier than having a close buddy over for supper. He truly despised formality, especially formal dinner events. He was once seated next to one of those spouting intellectuals. The witty dowager continued to gush about everything from a hangnail to a typhoon. Fred remained a patient and polite listener. Finally she started screaming about grand opera, which Fred despised. "I heard somewhere that you have a magnificent voice," Mr. McMurray tells me. "What song do you do best?" At this point Fred had been a touch too vague. It was impossible to resist the temptation. "The good ship Lollipop," he explained. beaming back at the woman with devastating charm. Fred McMurray's human and comic side is further portrayed in some of his quirks. He can't take the flavour of coconut and pineapple, for example. He wonders aloud, how can anyone eat such garbage? Another pet aversion is apples in a fruit salad, but don't tell him you're not a fan of shredded carrots. Alternatively, raisins in a pudding. He says, but they're so tasty, it's all in your head, she says. I'm sure you could survive on raisins and grated carrots if you didn't have anything else to eat. That's a different story with pineapple and coconut. Fred never comes home grumpy, no matter how difficult the day has been. If something went awry on set, Lily eventually learns about it from someone else. Fred worked with all of the industry's glitzy ladies. He never gossiped about his starring ladies or never brought any juicy set gossip home with him. When Lily went out with the girls, they'd gossip about the studio and inquire about what was going on there. If Fred knew that Garbo eloped with Mickey Rooney, I'd still have to read about it in the paper, Lily says flatly. Carole Lombard was Fred's favourite femme fatale, proving there was an attraction between opposites. He'd share a minor role with her, then a star with her peers. When a radio agency called to offer a job, Lily stated that Fred was on site in San Diego. He'd love to do that, she was certain. Perhaps at a later date. I see, the agent explained. I'm confident we'll be able to find someone to perform alongside Carole Lombard this time. Is it possible he said Lombard? If there was a chance to work with Carole, Lily felt certain Fred would return. They were each other's perfect audience. Nothing made Fred happier than getting Carole to giggle. If Fred didn't work with Carole, Lily was certain he would be dissatisfied. P.S. He was Carole's co-worker. Fred has had a bad memory and good health his entire life. He was the best athlete in high school. He was as good as the proverbial fiddle at odd occupations of all kinds. His love of sleeping grew out of a canvassing job that took him from house to house. A little dynamite helps him get up in the morning. He gets up at the crack of dawn if Claude Binion wants him to go duck shooting. He was periodically concerned about his health for no apparent cause. He once aced an insurance exam with flying colours. Do you think it would be a good idea for me to start taking vitamin B? He asked Lily. He had a hard time remembering names and numbers. He thought he could get away with it for a while. He'd recognise a face he'd seen before. He was certain he'd met the individual. He'd say hello, carefully avoiding mentioning anyone's name. If an introduction was required, he would politely inquire as to how the name should be spelled. He attended a banquet one night. The lady on his right appeared to be someone he knew. He sensed he'd known her for a long time. "We've known one another for such a long time," he finally said, "but it's a pretty amusing situation. I've never been able to spell your name correctly." The lady gave him a cold gaze and replied, "Smith." Fred looks forward to his duck hunting adventures. He enjoys growing his beard. He seems to have entirely forgotten that he is a public person. He once travelled to the high Sierras with Claude Binion. In the middle of the river he ran across an elderly fisherman. They were having a lot of fun. Then Fred's friend began to look at him with interest. Wasn't it the first time they'd met? "I'm sure it's in Bakersfield," Fred remarked nonchalantly. "I spend a lot of time in that town." Fred is a bright example of Hollywood steadiness now, in contrast to the shaky, colourful Hollywood of the past. True, no one will ever tell you about his champagne parties, alternatively great lavish, vast occasions. On his birthday the McMurrays usually throw a massive bash. Meanwhile Fred could retire for the rest of his life if he so desired. He once bought his second apartment building. He was looking for a citrus-growing ranch to help him guarantee his future. Fred's openness to follow the advice is a testament to his intelligence. His business manager, Beau Ruse, steered him in the right direction. Fred always despised being told what to do. Despite this, he never complained about being informed. As a result, he gave off the impression of being quite laid back. Everything was so simple. This was true up to a point. But in his quiet way he achieved incredible results. Perhaps the most trying time for them was when Fred left Roberta. He was brought to Hollywood by Paramount Pictures. Fred felt unsure about his prospects. Without an official engagement, they had reached an understanding. Lily concluded that it was better to wait. She arrived in California 3 months later. A screening test was unsuccessful. Lily landed a modelling gig at Magnin's. Every night they'd meet at the Lighted Tree, a tea shop on Sunset Boulevard. Their dinner was only 65 cents. All of this contributed to their success. If you liked this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you are new here, and if you want to support my work, please visit my Patreon page. How do you feel about Fred McMurray's contrastingly amusing life, shielded from Hollywood? Fred McMurray was the man everyone loved to be in the company of. Clark Gable and Carole Lombard particularly enjoyed his sense of humour, but Gable was equally fond of Spencer Tracy. Watch my video and find out why was Spencer Tracy respected even by Clark Gable.